we've come to a plan that we hope will be acceptable to you. We're going to move quickly through each of the interventions of my esteemed panelists. I'll make one simple response, and then I think what we'll do is give you an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. And when we get there, I'll remind you, of course, that a question actually ends in a question mark, okay? So with no further ado, so that we can abide by the time constraints, let's begin with Dr. Doran.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. It's been humbling listening to the panels during the day and sensing the magnitude of the problems and the challenges. I am also struck by where we are. I remember, as I'm sure many of you do, seeing the telecast from this location in 1989 when the wall came down. I at that point spent about a quarter of my life, or about a tenth of my life, I guess, in Germany. And so I had a lot of association with the significance of that wall coming down. Just a few weeks before that happened, I had become the secretary of the American Society of Comparative Law, and I was, as a result of the events of the wall coming down, catapulted really into all kinds of law reform initiatives going on in Central and Eastern Europe after that time. So this was very significant to me. What I want to direct your attention to, though, is the experience I had about 6 months later. I was on a trip through Central and Eastern Europe, and I happened to be here in Berlin on the day that they announced that they were going to bulldoze the rest of the wall. Some of you have some idea of the magnitude of that task, given just how extensive and strong the wall was. And I remember gathering some of the rocks from some of the bulldozers and taking them home. I've got them in my office at home. But what I want to just emphasize is that it's not just bringing down walls, we need to think about what to do next. Or someone talked this morning about the ground clearing and what it takes to build a new world after the walls come down. Now, I have a number of images of walls coming down. One thing that can happen is you can tear down walls and leave a vacuum. I think that's sort of what happened in Iraq. There are ways that walls become irrelevant. Think of the significance of social networking, for example, or I remember being at the Alhambra earlier, about a month ago, and having all the armaments described to me, and of course they're all just sort of totally irrelevant given modern technology. So that's another way that walls may disappear. I think I've often been impressed by a passage from the book of Isaiah, chapter 58. It talks about building in the old waste places, being a repairer of the breach, a restorer of paths to live in. And I think in the ultimate sense, what's vital is that we be able to tear down the walls in human hearts. And this is really the ultimate challenge. I was struck a little earlier today, someone mentioned magic wands, or I guess one could say there are no magic wands. I've worked on laws in a lot of places, and sometimes people think that once you write words on paper, this will be a magic wand to change reality. But of course, that's not how it works. There can be prayers, there can be good fortune, but much depends on people willing to do the long and arduous work of building bridges and resolving problems that of the kind that have just been described to us. In fact, often we restore paths to live in by building those kind of bridges. Now, I think in the process of rebuilding, we do need to think about international instruments, and the theme of this session is looking at the insistence of the international instruments on neutrality, on pluralism, and I think sometimes as we go in tomorrow and talking about constitution building, sometimes we forget that process of renewing constitutions or building new constitutions is not something that goes on with a tabula rasa. I remember working on the Iraqi constitution in 2005, and one of the things we realized is that Iraq had actually ratified without reservation the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This meant that there were some substantial obligations. Countries retain their obligations even if there's a regime change. Sometimes there are regime changes that ignore international law. But this, it's important to bear in mind that we have that background. We're bound, of course, not only by the language of the international instruments, but they are powerful because they help shape the expectations that people have. They reflect those expectations and desires, and they help in the sense that others, as countries are held to account by the international community, that is obviously important. Now, in many ways, the Turkish situation is arguably more complex. I remember many years ago, well, not that many, but the EU had issued some guidelines, among other things, that Turkey needed to rapidly adopt a Western-style association law that would accommodate registering of churches, religious organizations. This rapid request has not been met, but I remember working on this issue and realizing just how difficult it was because there wasn't a legal framework in place to do it. If you tried to do a legal framework, it was against what was really some of the genetic code provisions of the Turkish constitution, and you couldn't easily change those because they were unamendable. And I think one of the things I realized at the time is that much depends on being able to reinterpret what some of those background provisions mean, what the reinterpreting the Lausanne Treaty. I mean, I remember naively reading the Lausanne Treaty and thinking, oh my goodness, this is great. They just say you should treat minorities equally. That will solve the problem. Well, as we know, it doesn't get interpreted that broadly and that easily, but perhaps viewing it against the background of intervening international instruments and so forth, it gives sort of an opportunity for a new way of, a new and broader and more flexible way of looking at things. And I think that is really what is vital. All of the specific problems, unless one can solve the broader problem of a kind of rigid and unyielding notion of secularism, that needs to give way to a more flexible, more open kind of secularism, the kind of secularity that we have in many other countries. There are a lot of different models, but what the good models have in common is they make it easy for religious communities to organize. They make it easy for religious communities to be able to have legal entities. And they make it easy for religious communities to be able to acquire property, to be able to have places of worship. All of these things that make freedom of religion or belief a meaningful reality. Well, let me just wrap up by saying what's really critical is that we need to find ways and to find flexible ways to open up the basic constitutional notions that are the framework and that make it possible to provide new paths for people to live in. Thank you.